Hello, BookTube. All right, we're going to continue with our Q&A. I think we should be able to finish it in this video. This has been a ton of fun. Let's get right away. James Holder says, "What bookshelves border Mordor?" And those of you who don't know what the heck he's talking about, I have a built-in hutch in the wall of this room that I call the darkest depths of Mordor because it has bookshelves in it and the huge amount of space below them. And as you might guess, I just stuff books in there. I just cram books in there. And so it's scary. It's a scary place. And I call it the depths of Mordor because I almost never go in there, which is a perfect argument for not having books in there and an argument against keeping any of the books that are currently in there. But oddly enough, the thing that's right next to them is my favorite part of my books, and that is my new release bookcase. I have a whole bookcase. It's the length of a wall. The top shelf is at chest level, and that is stacks of the current month of release books. Right now it's July. And stack number one is the books released in the first week of July, second week of July, third week of July, fourth week of July. And then below that is all of my August books, and then below that is all of September. And I'm constantly rotating that shelf. So the book right next to Mordor, the bookcase right next to that, is actually Lothlorien. And also, James Holder asks, how are your fiction projects going? My fiction projects are going okay. I hit a snag with The Red Bishop, the serialized sword and sorcery fantasy that I'm writing for Weird Mask magazine. But other than that, everything's going fairly well. PRCZEK02 says, how did you learn about BookTube? What made you decide to make your first video? I learned about BookTube just by a random search. I stumbled across it, much in the way I bet a lot of you do, and found a lot of big, screaming, insane YA channels, and was a bit confused. In fact, for a long time, I thought that is BookTube. I thought what I bet a lot of people think the first time they see it, which is, oh, I see. So it's a section of YouTube devoted to screaming videos about kids' books. Okay. Well, now that I know that, nothing for me to see here, and they just go away and they never come back. I'm glad that I didn't think that, obviously. I thought that at first. But then I looked around a little more and found other videos on other things. And what convinced me to do it was Chris and Giselle Bradley. Or Chris and Giselle Rhodes. Chris Rhodes and Giselle Bradley, as they were then, convinced me that not only could I watch, but that I could do this. That not only could they film a video with me in it, but that the technology was not so hard as to prevent me from doing it. And then 3,000 videos happened. And James Holder asks, PRCZEK02 also asks about anything funny or weird that I have found in a book, in a used book that I've encountered. I haven't found many weird things. Urgent notes tucked into the middle of a book saying, when you get this, call me immediately, that sort of thing. Weird cartoons. I also once found a $100 bill in a book, and it was an old $100 bill. You could see by the filigree and the ink that it was old. Somebody had put a $100 bill in there, obviously, as a little hideaway against a sudden need, and forgotten that it was there, or maybe died, and maybe didn't tell anyone, so the relatives sell off the books, and the $100 bill is still in there. Maybe it went into boxes somewhere, or into an attic somewhere, and no one knew. And I found that $100 bill, and my first impulse was, oh wow, fantastic, I can buy something. And then I remembered, no, put it back in there and leave it. And if you forget that it's there, or you die while it's in that book, someone else will find it. Just leave it there. But in answer to this question, by far the weirdest thing that I have ever found in a book, it happened here in Boston about 30 years ago. I bought a used book at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston, and I found a picture of myself. A picture of me sitting on a rock by Jamaica Pond with a bunch of beagles. The beagles that I didn't have at the time that I saw the picture, that I'd had them before. And my first thought was, oh wow, this book must be mine. Right? That was my first thought. Oh, this book must be mine. I must have had this, put that picture in the book, and then sold it to the Brattle, and sometime forgot that the picture was in there. But then I studied it and realized that it was not mine. I know whose it was. I know who took that picture. The book belonged to him, not me. And he never told me that he was selling it, never told me even that the picture existed. It was a different picture of me from any that I had ever seen. That was the weirdest thing I've ever found in the book. Let's see here. The Lit Malaysian says, what are your thoughts on golden retrievers? I love them. Of course, I love all my babies. I love all of them. The Lit Malaysian wants to know, would I ever consider having one? Absolutely. But I don't go out of my way to get dogs. They come to me. So if a golden retriever does, then I wouldn't hesitate at all. God help me if that happens now. The little Fraulein sort of rules the roost. She wouldn't react well to a much bigger dog at all. I don't think she'd react well to anybody. Let's see here. Emil Roothoofd wants to know a book on the Roaring Twenties. I'm going to mention an oldie but a goodie. It's almost 100 years old. It's by the great Boston writer Frederick Lewis Allen. And it is only yesterday. Standard response. It was a multi-million-dollar bestseller, set him up for life, and it's still really good. So, and the benefit of it having been such a bestseller is that it'll be easy for you to find a copy. And Emil Roothoofd also asked, which Nobel authors are your favorites? For me, it would be a toss-up between Rudyard Kipling and William Butler Yeats, but I want to stress that it doesn't matter anymore. The Nobel doesn't matter anymore, and that is retrospective. That goes back to the very beginning, and it definitely holds true for the rest of time. The Nobel invalidated itself as any kind of literary prize when it was given to an illiterate cokehead who not only did not write the lyrics that he poorly sang a century ago, but cannot read. Has never written anything with his own pen in his own lifetime. When the Nobel Prize in Literature went to Bob Dylan, it became invalid. Not just for that year, and not just in the future, but also in the past. It doesn't matter that Thomas Mann or Doris Lessing won the Nobel, because they gave it to Dylan. It's retroactively invalidated. So I understand, the parameter why you would ask, but it's utterly meaningless. Might as well ask me about some other literary award. Laura C. asked, do I have any siblings? Yes, I do. Lillian Newswinder says, books about the roughly the period covered in Robert Graves' novel I, Claudius. And there are many, of course, they're innumerable. But one that I would recommend is the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote on that period and who is really good. Don't be put off or maybe intimidated at all by his status as a classic of ancient Rome. Pick him up and read him. I bet you'll find a surprise if you are coming at him from that mind frame of, an ancient Roman. I'm not. I don't know Latin. I'm not studied up enough on history to read these people. No, no. Tacitus with a good introduction and good notes is just fine. Believe me, he was writing for people like that. So people who aren't historians, I would give Tacitus a try and see what you think. Let's see here. Lattes and Mockingjays says, thoughts on the band Florence and the Machine? In response to this, I will repeat, all John Philip Sousa, all the time. And Lattes and Mockingjays also says that, and notes that The Hunger Games and Lovely Bones are both from a YA point of view, but only one of them is actually shelved in YA, and wants to know what's up with that. Is that a question of depth? Is it a question of presentation? It is entirely a question of presentation, yes. I know that I'm in the minority here, but if you take a step back and look at The Lovely Bones as a critical reader, you see that literarily speaking, it's absolutely not one bit better than The Hunger Games. It's usually just a matter of presentation, and you would be shocked at how rubbery that kind of distinction can be at editorial meetings, where books that you look at in your bookstore now and you think, oh yeah, well of course that's a staple of genre X. You would be amazed at how many times in editorial meetings at publishing houses that decision was made out of whole cloth, and that you could easily be knowing that book from somewhere else in the bookstore. It's totally artificial, in most cases, totally artificial. And Lattes and Mockingbird also wants to know, do I prefer coffee or tea? I don't like either one of them. I drink water, Tropicana Pure Premium Orange Juice, no pulp, and red wine. And that's it. Wilson Shugart asks, have you ever read War and Peace? Wilson Shugart asked, have I ever read War and Peace? Now he asked some other question, too. But the main question he asked was, have you ever read War and Peace? I say it's good that he's gone. We're better off without him. Have you ever read War and Peace? Why do people ask me the questions that start with "Have you ever read?" Why? Why do they do it? Why? War and Peace, one of the greatest novels ever written. Disinherited. Z. Maxwell asked rather forlornly, what about adding our doomed read-along of Machiavelli's The Prince to this day that had no read-alongs? Those of you maybe coming late to the party here, I had this brilliant idea for a month where we were going to do 4 read-alongs instead of 1 long read-along. We were going to do 4 short books. And it just fell apart. The whole idea just fell apart. My fault entirely. And the one that got left out was Machiavelli's The Prince, which we didn't do. So now it's sort of hanging there as this thing that we need to do. And we haven't done it yet. We're not going to do it today, but we will. We will do it. T-Bone asks, any good sociology books? Another opportunity for me to recommend Behave by Robert Sapolsky. I strongly recommend Behave by Robert Sapolsky. You are going to love it. And T-Bone also asks, how do you read without subvocalizing? Mentions that when T-Bone tries to read without subvocalizing, it retains nothing. Almost nothing. And what's meant here in the question is something that's come up on this channel many times, which is that you do not need to speak the words you're reading to yourself quietly in order to read them. That's subvocalizing. You're not talking the words, you're not saying them out loud, but you are pronouncing them in your mind, in the part of your mind that is involved in decoding spoken English or spoken language. And you don't need to do that. You can totally disregard that part of your mind and just read with your eyes. You straight to your brain. You can do it. You start out doing that, and then everything in the world conspires to make you read at the speed that you speak. But you don't need to read at the speed that you speak. You can divorce the one from the other. And I get this question all the time about retention, because the number one thing people say to me when I say, I've been saying this for decades, of course, people ask me, how do I read so much? I say, well, one of the big things you're doing wrong, if you want to read more, is that you're subvocalizing, and you shouldn't do that. There's no reason for it. And one of the things I hear from those people more than anything else over the decades is, well, when I don't subvocalize, I don't end up remembering anything that I read. And they link the two, and that's a false linkage. The reason that you're not remembering anything when you stop yourself from subvocalizing is because you're training your brain to do something new. So your brain is concentrating on the new thing you're training it to do. That's all. It could be anything. If I was saying syncopated drumming with one hand while you're reading, and you'd never done that before, and you were trying to train yourself to do it, if you did that, you also wouldn't remember what you were reading, even if you were subvocalizing. It's just a question of time. That's all. Time and practice. If you practice subvocalizing, or if you practice reading without subvocalizing, sooner or later your retention will go up. It will go to normal. There are plenty of people who've never subvocalized, and it's not like they have poor retention. It's just practice. That's all. Let's see here. Let's press on. We can do this in one video. I know we can. Zinaya asks, what do I think of Hermann Hesse? I like him fine. What do I think of Franz Kafka? I think he's great. And what do I think of Stefan Zweig? He's never really done it for me. I've tried. I've talked to fans of his. I will try again. I've mentioned in these Q&A videos, he's ripe. So is Hermann Hesse for new translations, for new editions, where I will get them in the mail, where a publisher, they will be new, and therefore they will fall into my new bailiwick. My bailiwick these days, these last 10 years, is new releases. So these are prime candidates. Kafka, yes, all the time, but the other two are prime candidates for a new systematic, just a sweeping translation of all works, or all major works, and they will come to me, and then I will give them another try. The Room Note asks, Howard Berg, legit or fraud? Not sure what is meant by this. I know a Howard Berg. He's a molecular biologist, and he's totally legitimate. I don't think he can possibly be the Howard Berg that you're talking about. There must be some other Howard Berg who maybe is a fraud, but you're not talking about a Massachusetts-born molecular biologist, I assume. PK's Books asks, what's the best thing book-wise to come out of Scotland? Why, that would be you. T-Bone asks again, any advice for college or university students? I laughed out loud when I read this. I do. Yes. I have lots of advice for college and university students. Lots of advice. In fact, so much advice that it needs a video of its own. And it needs a video of its own so bad that I'm going to do it this week. I'm amazed that I haven't thought about this before. I will do a video on this subject this week and expound at great length on advice for college and university students. I've spent most of my life giving advice to college and university students. I have a lot of it. John Garganarakis asks, what was your favorite Shakespeare play to teach and why? For me, it was my favorite Shakespeare play. It was Julius Caesar. And the why is for any number of reasons. First of all, most students will know something about Julius Caesar. He's not a vague figure. You know, good luck with Henry VI, with college freshmen. But with college freshmen will feel some familiarity with Julius Caesar. So that's partly is that, you know, Shakespeare's intimidating on his own. So anything that will limit the intimidation is good. And with Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you have two things. You have the fact that Julius Caesar is well known. People know that he was assassinated. And you've also got the famous soliloquy, the famous speech by Mark Antony. And most students have heard of that, at least, or know a little bit of it. So you've got a little grounding. That's good thing number one. Good thing number two is that it's a great example of Shakespeare's use of history. It's not typically, you know, classed as one of his history plays, but it is one, and he was scrupulously following the, you know, written accounts of Julius Caesar that he had in front of him. So you can interest students, I found you could interest students in that as well, because you could tell them the history and how it varies from the play. And that gets a conversation started about why Shakespeare would make it vary from the actual history, and why he would include stories word for word that are in the actual history. That gets you talking about dramatics, which is always fun to do with students, because then you're right down at the beginning level. You're right down at the nuts and bolts where you need to be. You lose your students if you start to make them think that there's some highfalutin theoretical discussion happening somewhere in Oxford that they're not part of and don't know anything about. You'll lose them right away if you do that. Instead, you want to get them involved in the text. And the third big thing for Julius Caesar, for me, for teaching it, is that it shouldn't work. It's a disaster of a play. I mentioned this when I did a video about Julius Caesar. It shouldn't work. The title character dies in the middle of the play. The whole, almost half the thing is weird, stuttering anticlimax where you don't even know who to latch onto, what you're supposed to believe in. Students react to that. They notice it right away and they react to it. And the ones on the first meeting of class, when everybody's supposed to have done the reading, typically 20% will have. And on that first day, the one thing that you want to do to make sure that the 80% that didn't do the reading do it next time is to make them feel like they're missing out on something fun. And you will definitely do that when you're talking about when you're talking about what is wrong with the play, the odd parts of the play, with the 20% who've done the reading. The conversation is going to be interesting. The 80% who's not done the reading are going to want to know what they're missing. They will come back. Your percentage will go way up in the next class. I was always very strict with my classes ahead of time. I would say, all right, it's 2 weeks out now. I want to make absolutely sure we all know this is what is due for this day in class. That's what we're going to be discussing. That reading is due that day. And then when that day came, I would say, okay, I'm respecting you enough to be honest with you. I'm expecting that you'll be honest with me. I want a show of hands. How many people have done the reading? And when the hands went up of people who, then I would say, okay, you are the ones I want to talk to. So if you didn't raise your hand just then, don't answer any of these questions, because I don't want to hear you speculating on something you haven't read about. So you can listen and you can take notes, but you can't participate unless you've done the reading. I'm not going to listen to you BSing like this was on your dorm floor. That got results as well. And this person also asks, single best live performance that you've ever seen. These things are tricky. I've seen so many live Shakespeare performances, more than I can count. And they're tricky because you'll go to one that is renowned at the West End or in Broadway, that is renowned, something that has lines or that has everybody talking about it, and maybe you don't get it on the right night. There's a magic to Shakespeare, to any theatrical performance, that unless the thing is just clockwork mechanics, then any night can be that night. Any night can be the best performance that you ever see. And that happened to me in an outdoor theater somewhere in the American Midwest. It wasn't in Iowa. It was somewhere in the American Midwest in an outdoor theater. This group was doing Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh, no, they were doing The Tempest. And The Tempest is not one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I think it's a little heavy-handed. And also, I had talked to people in my group and in the audience who I know that'll strike you as strange that I struck up a conversation with a bunch of strangers. I did. I still do. But I asked around, and people said, oh, yeah, I have a son, or, I have a nephew in this performance, so I've seen it many times, and I got to say, they're doing their best. They have some people who don't act. Some of it is community theater or less. So, we know that you've seen Shakespeare all over the place, and some of the best companies in the world. So don't get your hopes up too much. You might want to think of this as just, local theater. And I said, okay, duly noted. I have liked some local theater, absolutely. I pay attention. I notice things to like. And the staff, the cast was just on fire. They were just on fire. It was by far the best production of The Tempest that I have ever seen. It was unbelievable. and the audience was blown away. And you could tell, I was close enough to the stage, so you could tell that the cast was blown away. They knew it. They knew, any of you who are in theater, anyone of you who've ever been in theater, you'll know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you have caught lightning in a bottle and you know it. You know it when it's happening. And it's almost like nothing can go wrong. You don't ever want to think that, because then something will. But it's almost like you're all on the same wavelength, and all of a sudden the guy who plays, the Duke, and who's been dogging it for the last 10 performances, all of a sudden he's incredible, he's believable. All of a sudden he's channeling his stuffed shirt uncle, just like you've been asking him to do, only this time he's doing it. And so is everybody else. Oh, I still get chills when I think about it. And when it was over, everybody in the audience felt the same thing. Not just the people I was with, but the people I talked to in the audience. They all said, well, can you come with us to every performance? Because whatever you brought with you, we've never seen that before. That can happen. I bet all of you have theater. All of you theater goers probably have stories like that. In other words, where it isn't the Fantastics or Wicked or whatever that you're seeing for the 80 millionth performance that is just by now completely rote. That it's not that. Instead, it's something that's totally unpredictable that sticks with you forever. I love that. I absolutely love it. But we still have another question here. What are my thoughts on Timon of Athens? I don't particularly like it. It's not a particularly good play. Very contrived, but it's Shakespeare, so there'll be moments of magic in it. Let's see here. William asked, would you ever consider doing a starter kit on Regency romance authors? I was having this discussion with Brian at Bookish. I would, but it would be pointless, because most people look down on Regency romances as the worst of romance, as utterly programmatic and vapid. And the authors know that, and they don't care. They're working out of love. But my point with Brian was, the thing to get over first is the straitjacket limitations of the subgenre. If you're not okay with that, if you don't acclimate yourself to that, then the individual variations of any author aren't going to matter at all. I think a starter kit on Regency romance authors would be beside the point until you've reached that point. And most people who tell me, what are some good authors to start with? I've never read a Regency romance. It's not going to matter. They're going to balk at the form. So why bother with the authors? I can certainly go on for great lengths at the variations between Regency romance authors, but I think for a start you should probably try one or two or three. And of course, as I've mentioned to many, many people over the decades since I saw the light on Regency romances, you don't read any of them until you've read Pride and Prejudice. You have to read Pride and Prejudice. I know that all of you have, because we had a mandatory read-along, and you wouldn't dare ignore a mandatory read-along. But everybody else, you have to read Pride and Prejudice. It is the model and the imprint of all Regency romances that come after it. Anyway, let's see here. PHXSNS1 asks, what do I think of James McGee? I don't like him. What do I think of Janet Malcolm? I don't like her. What do you think of Primo Levi? I don't particularly like him. I like him more than the other two, but not a whole lot. And do you like roller coasters? If by that you mean do I like riding on roller coasters, you have to be nuts. You have to be nuts. I would not swim past the breakers in the ocean at dawn or sunset because I don't want to get eaten by a shark. I would not ride on a roller coaster because I have seen them built. I've seen the roadies come to town. They don't have any skill whatsoever. They're certainly not an architect on hand. And they slap this thing together in 2 hours while sousing drunk. You think we're going to ride on such a thing? No. No, I'm not going to ride on such a thing. So I love roller coasters as setups to inevitable gore and horror in horror movies. particularly Final Destination 2, if those of you who know what I mean. But otherwise, no. No. Matthew L. asks, do I prefer Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler? It varies from day to day. They're so interchangeable. Raymond Chandler probably would get... Probably if I had two in front of me, one from each, I'd probably pick him first, but they're so similar in a lot of ways that I don't think are particularly good. And Matthew L. also wants to know what I think of Philip K. Dick. And he stinks. He's god-awful. So if you've just read him, I think the question mentioned that you just read him, and you're wondering what you think of him, that's because, if that's true, I don't know if I'm remembering that right, but I've known plenty of people who are in that position where they just read Philip K. Dick, and they're wondering whether or not they like what they've just read. And that is not a question of literary analysis at all. That is very simple. Your reading brain is telling you that stank. But you know that Philip K. Dick is considered the coolest author in the world by every stoner on every college dorm floor. And so you know already that he comes with this baggage, like Alice Munro, where you're supposed to like him. Where I just read it and I don't know whether I like him or not. That isn't true. If you come out of one of his books and you're thinking, I don't know whether I like it or not, what you really mean is, I didn't like it. and now I'm wondering how I'm supposed to move the goalposts so that I can say that I did. Because I'm not allowed to say that I didn't. You are allowed to say that you didn't. The reason that you come out of Philip K. Dick thinking you didn't like him is because you didn't like him. He stinks. Let's see here. We're getting to the end. We actually are going to do this in 3 videos. Gary M. asks what my thoughts are on the strip cover lit situation. Those of you who might not have followed the drama, I'm sure you saw some reaction videos in your YouTube subscription feed. There was a channel, a BookTube channel, Script Cover Lit, that was hosted by Adrian Fort and Dalton Gentry, and they were very active booktubers in BookTube 2.0, this new crowd of booktubers that I'm a part of, and a lot of booktubers you watch are a part of. And after years of doing videos, accusations started to surface, some of them, attached to other booktubers and to individual people, and some of them anonymous, of women who were complaining about sexual attention paid to them, unwanted, on the part of Adrian Fort. And it led to a mess. It led to a messy situation. I think it blindsided Adrian, so a lot of his initial responses were very, very poor. He did eventually issue an apology. There's also a number of reaction videos that are well worth your time to watch, and also worth your time to watch just because you got to be omnivorous. You got to be omnivorously curious about everything. There's also a video in defense of Adrian Fort, drawing a kind of string and pins on a whiteboard conspiracy theory about the whole controversy itself. And regardless of what actually happened and how it actually happened, I mean, I tend to believe that a lot of these women were made to feel distinctly uncomfortable, and I don't know why, if you were a young woman as a fan of BookTube, or even a young woman who was a BookTuber, I can't imagine why you would come forward and say such a thing if it didn't happen. I think we're kind of past that as far as asking your question. But the thing my main reaction to it, I mean, Strip Cover Lit has stopped making videos. I think it would probably be best if they continued to stop making videos. I don't think there's any way you get out from under this kind of a cloud, especially when I missed them, of course. I missed their content was energetic. I agreed with almost none of it, but I still loved the energy, and I loved the sense of community that they were building around their channel. But my main reaction to this whole thing is a little bit one step removed from, of course my reaction is that, of course, if you're in a position as a booktuber with thousands of subscribers and you're reaching out to people who have dozens or hundreds of subscribers and asking them for making inappropriate comments to them that you then later classify as a joke, that is, of course, reprehensible behavior. You ought to know better than to do that. Even if you weren't raised to know better, you should know better than to do that in 2019, where you've had several dozen extremely high-profile cases marched in front of your eyes in the daily news of how that is no longer acceptable. Nothing like that is acceptable anymore. It never was. But now there's a whole social movement designed to expose it immediately. So that, of course, is my immediate reaction to the whole thing is just, oh, come on. But my step back, sort of meta reaction, is sadness, just sadness, because that kind of thing, again, if you only watch BookTube videos, which I strongly recommend, if you don't watch the rest of YouTube, then you won't know it, but that kind of thing characterizes the rest of YouTube up and down the street. And I never wanted it to come to this little corner of YouTube. I never wanted it to do so. So quite apart from the what happened or didn't happen, or he said or she said, or the ickiness of the whole thing, there's also a huge part of me that just wishes it hadn't happened. You can't get innocence back like that. I don't want that to have ever happened to this corner of YouTube. And now it has. Now we've had a sexual harassment scandal. That's just... it's just, the whole thing is sad. The whole thing is a pity. If there's one silver lining in the whole thing, it's that it hasn't shut down our little corner of BookTube altogether. We have banded together. We have banded together and decided to go on, to like each other, to continue watching each other, to not lose heart, I guess. It's just an ugly and lamentable thing. And my heart goes out to, especially to a couple of times in a couple of videos, and as this thing was unfolding, it came out that a lot of new booktubers were approached immediately by Adrian and welcomed to BookTube. Now, the video in defense of Adrian Fort pointed out that he did this to everybody, male and female, young and old. But I don't know, those earnest welcomes, sometimes on the BookTube newbie tag, sometimes within an hour, there'd be that thing saying, "Hi, we're Strip Cover Lit, welcome to BookTube." In retrospect, in light of what did happen years later with a whole group of young women, those welcomes seem extra creepy. If there was an element of, I think somebody that I talked to called it grooming. If there was an element of that involved, that just makes it even worse, and that attaches itself not only to BookTube but to the BookTube newbie tag, which lots of people use to find new booktubers and make them welcome. How does that not get tainted if there was a case in which lots of those welcomes had an ulterior motive? Just, as you can see, I have lots of thoughts on the subject. It is a sad subject, but at least we're all here. I think that Adrian and Dalton probably made the right decision to shutter their channel, and I think it would be the right decision for it to stay shuttered, because it can't help but come back with all of this baggage, and this baggage was traumatic enough to go through once, not going through it again. But those are some of my thoughts on the subject. And then we're almost done here. We're almost done. The Room Note has another question. When are you doing a read-along of classic literature such as Kurt Vonnegut or John Green? I'm never going to do a read-along of either one of them. And the last question, we got to the end, not a long video, but still, better than 5 videos. Ryan Reed says, do you have favorite books of the Bible? And I do. In the Old Testament, by far and away, it is the book of Genesis. And in the New Testament, actually, by far and away, it is the Gospel according to St. Luke. There isn't really close competition to either one of those, so I guess, they would count as my overwhelming favorites. And this new translation of the Book of Job that's coming out, I read the introduction, I read a bit of it, and it didn't do anything to challenge that. I think Genesis is just amazing in terms of teachability, in terms of thought-provoking, in terms of beauty. I just love it. And the Gospel according to St. Luke, there's a lot there. So anyway, that was our Q&A, our week 5, because June had 5 weeks. We did a Q&A, and we got a lot of questions done. So there you go. I'm going to wrap this up, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.